Good morning. My name is Will Jackson, and it's Global Payroll Day. So, thought what better than to talk to you about payroll. And without further ado, I've got some slides. Bit wordy, so we'll rattle through. There's quite a few, but I'm sure you'll be all right. And I thought I'd better introduce you, really, I suppose, to who we are. So we're the Leppington Group. Hopefully, you've heard of us. If you haven't, I need to speak to my marketing team probably, but we're an independent consultancy, and we are deemed as the payroll experts. I say that probably more than anyone else, but we are. There's a small group of us, and we help businesses improve payroll. And we do that through consultancy. We recommendation of solutions and providers, softwares, and we're always focusing on payroll compliance and efficiencies in payroll. Our mission is to empower organisations with expert payroll advice. It would be daft if we'd had a mission otherwise. And as a company profile, where did we come from? So I started the company quite a while ago now. It's taken different evolutions over the years. I wanted to create a business that was independent, so we have no affiliations with service providers in a sense of referrals or commissions. We're very affordable. We typically operate on for the clients. We do equally operate with vendors as well to improve softwares and operational efficiencies. Ultimately, aside from the audits we do and the health checks, navigating typical issues in payroll, procuring payroll services technology, vendor selections, implementations, mediations, administration, and cyber and privacy, we're just trying to make payroll better. And we think we do, and our customers think so too. So we're carrying on to do that, and we do quite well with that. So my name's Will. I founded the company. I'm the CEO, and with me, supported by a team of now 14 consultants within the business, all working in different areas of expertise around payroll. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the silent critical function, and which it is, and how payroll now more than ever probably needs elevating in this kind of massive age of change. And what I'm going to cover off is a couple of areas really. Is I think it's important to understand the view of payroll by senior leadership, also how payroll's involvement in decisions happens, some sort of reality check on technology. I think it's important, especially around operation model maturity. Then we start to get into a bit more detail around compliance, pressure, and ownership. A big area is, for me, around talent, skills, and especially career pathways. And then really, because of the nature of payroll, it would be remiss of me not to talk about risk, resilience, and the sleepless nights that it causes for so many. And then I'll kind of wrap it up. So I think if you were to look at the understanding of payroll from the leadership's eyes, and again, this is based on what I see, what I experience. So it's my opinion, but it is definitely still seen as a back office task. And I think you only really need to spend a couple of minutes on social media, Googling payroll, to realise that this seems to be a drum a lot of people are banging. It is seen as a cost, a back office, and it's not seen as a strategic risk and trust function. I think often leaders do underestimate how fragile it is. I think, and especially that just one key action, one bad change, as I've put here, can really derail a whole payroll operation. The complexity is invisible, not to payroll people. It's very clear, but for leadership, it is invisible, especially around the complexities that you typically see in business around multiple contracts, the rules, especially when you start to look at global payroll. No single country payroll is the same as any other. Typically, data is a big headache for payroll, and I think the risks are definitely underappreciated. And again, these are the kinds of things that I often see when we're consulting and improving people's payrolls. And it's one of those weird functions in business where the success is silent. So if everyone's got paid and it's correctly, that's normal. That's what good looks like. So it's only really a function that gets any attention when it isn't successful. And I think the key thing there, it's probably one of those only functions you see in business where even 99.9% correct is still seen as not success. And I don't see that in any other function. There's probably some. What I also see is payroll's involvement in decisions. So very often when you're looking at changing something in a business, specifically around technology, service providers, whatever, the driver is generally around HR and finance. There's always the question, does payroll sit in HR and finance, or even IT, to be honest? But what is very clear is when people are going into those kind of design decisions, they're not generally involving payroll. It's generally one of those views that sits somewhere else for the purposes of those sorts of discussions. It is still treated as an output of upstream decisions, therefore. So it captures data, it processes data, it outputs data. And so it's not generally considered a co-designer of workable processes and controls, which I find really odd. In fact, I find that very odd. And again, payroll, I've said in the previous slide, it's only really called out once something breaks, once it's not right. And I think the risk there is allowing it to fail or having it fail. It becomes a reactive response to fixing it. So therefore, fixing it's generally on the hoof. It's typically quite expensive because it has to be done now. And it's really hard to it's very manual, but it's very hard to unwind as well, especially if you've got regular payrolls like weekly payrolls. They still exist. Predominantly, there are a lot of weekly payrolls. But again, if you've got a problem with that, then it's a case of trying to keep on top of that in order to kind of maintain the status quo of that success that you were trying to get in the first place. So the organisations that do get it right, because I think it's key to highlight that, are the ones that do bring payroll into the room at the same time in those earlier discussions. So I'm not saying it needs to be a discussion in its own right, but it definitely needs to factor into HR, finance and IT discussions, especially when you're looking at doing significant changes, especially around software or transformation. So what do I see organisations rushing into? Well, they love AI tools at the minute, and they love global solutions, and they love a marketing promise. All of it's pre-sales and marketing. And organisations do love kind of marketing fog, I think. It is the grass is greener kind of approach. And I think a lot of people rush into what the new state is going to be before really checking whether they've got the stability in their business, and especially around data readiness. And often the transformations we get involved in, and the ones we do get involved in, are typically ones that are struggling. This is the two main areas we find haven't had the time and the focus on before engaging and rushing into, I would say, some form of transformation. The idea of moving to one strategic vendor everywhere without understanding the kind of nuances within the business, especially around things like localization, service quality, risk, and also exit options. I think it's a kind of mythical being, the one service provider for every country. There are models, and there are very good models, there are very fragmented models, but the idea of having one throat to choke for everything is possible, but I think you have to actually understand below the water what that actually looks like. Buying self-service front ends without fixing core processes. This is always the thing, the user experience, the UX UI, how easy it is to go from A to B in kind of workflows without really looking at how that processes from a data point of view or a transactional point of view, and especially not how that then feeds into payroll. That seems to be a big rush, is how does an employee or a manager go from X to Y or A to Z actually, if the core process underneath it aren't mapped or thought about properly. So I love marketing, and I love going to events and hearing people speak about their wonderful propositions and technologies and services and how they are literally the answer to every single problem I have. I love that. but I think it's also important to separate the innovation from the marketing. So what I mean by that is, when you're in that market, you need real use cases. And when I say real use cases, you've got a perfect buyer advantage here to get whatever you need to satisfy yourself that you are getting the true innovation and the true green grass, other than the verbalization of what it is. So demos and slides are fantastic. They are beautifully delivered these days, and the technology looks fantastic. But you need to, and it sounds logical, you need to look for those real use cases. What organizations are similar to us that are successful for you? And also, which ones aren't? What do you struggle with? Let's speak to those let's look at those use cases. Let's read through them, not the marketing use cases either. You know, you need to see proof at scale, I think is really my point. References. A lot of people skip this, or they accept the references they're given. Now, it's very difficult, because for organizations providing services and technology, they often don't want to put their customers forward into their sales cycles, not because of what they're frightened the customer will say. It's a bit of an ask for a client, and often clients don't like to have that publicity, and also it often costs the service provider in order to do that. But there is no doubt that those customers that are willing to be put forward for references are typically quite well looked after, and obviously the best customers for that provider. But again, this is an area you've got to kind of navigate to. If a service provider is keen to work with you, then they need to be able to show you and demonstrate to you the effort that you need in order to make those decisions. And so I think things like references in similar industries, and definitely in complexity, and I think speaking to the operational users, not just those kinds of exec sponsors, is also key. And if you can spend some time with them, again, I know this is a very difficult area to actually deliver for a provider, but at the same light, this is not a small purchase, and it's definitely not a light task you're about to undertake. So again, that diligence is really important. Also, I think it's up to you really to challenge how the tool handles those messy exceptions. So it's great to be shown something, the happy path as I call it, but actually I think it's really important to say, well, that's great that you've shown me that, and that's very well prepared and very well rehearsed, but actually this is my problem statement. So show me how your tool handles that. And that might not be something they can do straight away, but it definitely gauges your qualifying of their appetite to work for you if they're willing to cater for that. Follow the money. It's all about the money. Don't care what anyone says. Does it reduce risk, cost, or effort in a measurable way? They're the key focuses. Cost is the major impact. Risk is cost is the major consideration. Risk is the major impact, and the effort involved in it. I think there's got to be some sort of measurement to those three things that prove to you that this is worth it. No one wants to invest money in doing something that ultimately costs them more money and increases risk. So I think how you get into those facts is also quite key. So time and support to adopt tech. So payroll teams are always asked to implement new tech alongside their day jobs, and there's generally no capacity relief, which I think is the wrong approach, because what you're doing there is you're telling that team that you didn't think they were busy enough to start with. So here, have this major kind of pressurized additional thing to do, and I think that just sets up for failure. If somebody typically is occupied and busy in their daily life, in their work life, giving them more to do again is just compressing pressure. Training is often treated as like a one-off event. You know, we've heard of train the trainer and things like this, and often in the system's intuitive. It isn't. It's never intuitive. It gets intuitive, but never have I ever got into some sort of technology environment and just known how to use it, unless it's something very, very light, like a LinkedIn or a Facebook, or any social medias, or an Amazon. Generally, payroll technology is not something you can just waft your way into and manage okay with. So, and often training is done at the beginning, and I think this is a massive miss here. I think the best adoptions are when training becomes part of the culture and it becomes a regular iteration. And especially when you think about how technology is evolving, there's new stuff happening all the time. And again, relying on a user who does something very iteratively all the time to then kind of understand and explore new functionality or new things is not good for adoption. And so I think a lot of it falls on the organization to facilitate a culture of good training, good adoption, but also I think the service provider. It's very easy for the customer success areas of service providers to really kind of drop off after the deal has been won. And I think that's a crucial miss here, and I think that's a thing that everyone should push for. Very rarely do people think about change management in the right way. It's not uncommon for me to speak to a broader business, aside from the stakeholders, and ask the question, do you know why your senior management are doing this? And sometimes there's very different answers in the room. And I think that's just one indication, I think, whether the change has been managed well within the broader business. Because I think if you don't fully understand why you're doing this, then it's very difficult to adopt to that change. And I think involving the business is generally a good thing as well, is understanding ultimately what the change is, but then also how to actually be part of that change as well. Have some skin in the game, really. So where adoption works well, leaders explicitly ring-fence the time, they backfill roles, again, so crucial, and they do accept a temporary dip in productivity. And again, I always say, look, you've got to prepare, then you've got to plan, and then you've got to execute. So, operating model maturity. Grippy title, this one. So, when you're scaling anything, especially around countries and especially around payroll, what do I see that usually breaks first? The process usually breaks first, basically. What you see then is each country or unit, so it can be adopted to larger organizations with larger units, but let's say each country, for the purpose of this, each country starts to improvise. And suddenly that generic standard everyone was aiming for starts to not quite be as standard and repeatable as what the intention was. And that's just natural human nature. Governance then typically follows. So if you've got kind of unclear ownership, I put weak controls, inconsistent approval as an example, and sign off, what you start to find then, if people are starting to move from standard, that kind of ideal operating model, then and start to find ingenious different ways of getting to the finish line, what you find then is governance isn't followed. And then you find that the documentation element of it is not upkept. Then you find that they just get those kind of complete disparages between different units. Ultimately as well, people are struggling to get to the finishing line following that global model, then people naturally burn out. And what you do end up with is these heroes holding everything together. And you often see that a lot of the time. Who's your payroll hero? I think if you've got a payroll hero, that's your first red flag that you've probably got a risk in your business. Because then everything happens with the hero is they start to hold everything together. And payroll people are very good at doing that. They start to contain more information in their heads. They start to become that kind of real limiter, actually, as well as being a hero. And what you start to have is that reliability on certain people that are just devoted to getting this over the line and willing to kind of sacrifice their personal lives in order to do it. They are great signs, I think, of an operating model which is starting to break or has already broken. So I often get asked this: is standardization always right? So it is essential for controls. It is essential for reportability, and it's vital for scaling or scalability. But the reality is, not every local nuance should be forced into a global template. I think the 80-20 rule is a great one here. So 80% of the time, global template. 20, it has to be the exceptions. And that's fine, but they have to be well governed, those as exceptions as well. So too much standardization, well, what does it do? It creates non-compliance, the workarounds we talked about, creation of these heroes, and and I think where genuinely that local law, cultural differences or whatever appear. So I think forcing the 90-10 or the 100 is just, it's not possible. You have to accept that there's going to be some nuances. And again, this applies beautifully to global payroll, but it actually also applies to a lot of businesses. There's, of all sizes. You can't standardize everything. You just can't do that. So I think I always say, go standard where sensible, local where necessary, but have those very clear design principles and also that governance supporting that. So payroll is one of those things where there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of compliance, and there is ownership, but it can be a bit vague as you start to go up the greasy pole of a business. So coping with mid-year, mid-cycle changes. So what you typically find is teams are generally firefighting this. A lot of organisations are not on the front foot for these kinds of things. And to be fair, a lot of governments issue changes with little notice. And we've seen it before, especially in the UK, where the government will blame the payroll providers' technology for not being updated quick enough for changes that were coming through legislation. And I have a big issue with that because I don't think that's the case. But arguably what you find is there's a firefighting for changes, and especially the off-cycle stuff. Interpreting them is difficult. Compliance isn't getting easier. In fact, it just gets more and more complicated. Trying to update systems is hard enough for the technology providers, but also your own controls and also the complexities within your business that fits into those kinds of changes. And all of this while you're trying to actually keep the lights on and run payrolls as well. So you find a lot of organisations do rely on vendors and networks to interpret stuff quickly. But actually, the result of that is it sort of becomes somebody else's problem in one sense. It's that kind of nobody owns the problem. So what you find is you lose a lot of time trying to cater for that. And I think often the testing time is actually the one that's sacrificed. And I think that's crucial. Understanding a change is one thing, applying it is another, but making sure that it remains accurate and correct is really the vital one. So a lot of companies don't do change forecasting. Now this is kind of the crystal ball of impossibility, really. You can kind of know what's coming through the lines, but actually do you regularly have iterations where you're reviewing what's changing, forecasting that and planning that? So again, this is planning, basic planning, resource planning and strategy around that. And so a lot of organizations see that time to do that as a bit of a nice to have, and I think that's always a bit of an oversight actually. So the best prepared teams, they do maintain a change calendar. Do you have one? Probably should. Regression testing, and having those pre-agreed playbooks. This is iterative, remember, so a lot of this can be prepared and then executed. But again, the best teams generally approach it that way, and that's what we would advise most teams do. Now, I thought it'd be interesting to actually ask the question, who owns payroll compliance? Because who owns payroll is generally a bit of a grey area. So who owns the compliance? So I think, again, it's my opinion, I think accountability should sit with business leadership. Should do, shouldn't it, for payroll? Because we don't have chief payroll officers. And I don't necessarily, and I'll get shot for saying this, I don't necessarily think we do need them. I think that the accountability for it should sit with the CFO or the CHRO. Ultimately, it's probably the biggest risk to the business. So I don't really care who it sits with, but I would lean on the CFO and the CHRO to probably use their voice at that table to represent payroll better. So that's a call to action for them. They'd probably disagree with that. I don't know whether they would or not. I'm not really that bothered. But the point is, that's my opinion. And I think having payroll well represented there does need that kind of expert behind them in order to educate them, because they can't be the payroll expert whilst they're a CFO or CHRO. But what they do need is a strong payroll expert behind them in order to help them improve their accountability. So there's no doubt that payroll owns the process and the execution, but I think HR owns the data quality and finance owns the funding and reporting. And then we've not even considered legal in here. they own the interpretation. And if you think about it, there's one I've not got on here. IT probably owns the architecture. So I always use the analogy: if anyone's got kids and they've gone on a large family holiday, I always use the analogy that when you're sitting around the pool and the kids are in the pool, everyone's watching the kids, but in a weird way, no one's watching the kids. And I think that's the same with payroll. Everyone seems to be involved, but no one seems to be accountable. And I think if you've got a large family holiday with kids in the pool, I think somebody needs to have the flag that says, I am accountable for the kids. And it's not everybody that's kind of sitting there going, yeah, we're all watching them, but nobody's kind of watching them in that sense. And I think that's the key one here is I often see who is accountable for. I ask the question all the time, who is accountable for payroll? It's not the payroll manager that's accountable for payroll, for the reasons of point 2, because there's so many senior stakeholders that have some sort of investment in this. So if payroll is contained in HR finance, which it usually are, then they are accountable. But I do think the call to action on payroll is that you need to enable them in order to be accountable. So one of my favourite topics is around talent, skills and career pathways. Personally in TLG, I love hiring people and experiencing their career journeys. I think that's a fantastic thing. It's very easy to hire ready-made experts, but actually my preference in any business I've ever run is that I love to see people develop and grow. So I think, especially around payroll, this is really, really prevalent. So I think as an organization, how do you invest in that capability? So many organizations underinvest. Many payroll teams are very small and they absorb all this stuff, all this pressure. They've got new rules, tools, growth, they've got expectations, they've got the day job. I think you also find that training budgets are really thin. Most payroll people, we often ask the question, fell into payroll, and they fell into it by learning people from the job. And I always talk about Glenys, my payroll manager back in the day. She was the hero, and I think anybody who worked with Glenys would agree. But that's how I learned payroll, was being around it. There were no courses I went on. So I think, again, that's because training budgets were so thin, and maybe because it was seen as some sort of back office admin. But I think key thing is that's still quite the case. A lot of companies don't allow payroll people to have the appropriate training, and there's so much out there that's really good as well. And I said just a minute ago, most people didn't choose payroll as a career, but it's one of those weird careers where people get into payroll and they do remain in it and they love it. But when I look at the education system, there doesn't seem to be a way into payroll from a kind of education. It's a fantastic profession with great earning capability as well, and it's one of those jobs that ultimately is never going to go away, and it's been around as long as any other job ever. So it's a fantastic career and a fantastic profession, but it's just not really recognized unless you fall into it, which is so weird. So I think where we see organizations that are serious, they have really defined career paths, they have certifications, and also key to that, the good ones I've seen have really good rotation. So payroll people start to rotate through HR and finance, and they get a great holistic knowledge of the business and how those functions are so important to each other. The risks of concentrated knowledge. I've banged on about payroll heroes. Everyone has a payroll hero in their organization. Mine was Glenys. We've talked about her. But when it all sits with two people, that's fantastic. But they are massive points of failure. I speak about a situation where a whole payroll team didn't turn up on a Monday morning, and it was the week for running payroll. That was the one time that organization really appreciated how important and what high risk function it was in their business. But the nature of payroll is pressurized. You know, you do pick holidays around payrolls. You know, the fatigue involved in that, you know, burnout, resignation, you know, retirement. You know, these are massive points of failure. And I think if you have a payroll hero in your business, that's a good thing in one sense, but it is also a red flag that you've got a single point of failure. It definitely weakens internal challenge. You know, if the hero makes a mistake, how do you expect anyone else to spot it or correct it? Because they were the person that always QCs the payroll, for example. So I think it also really damages succession sometimes as well. Payroll heroes, payroll managers, there's not a lot of churn in those roles in organizations, and I think what you do find is that career path starts to become a little bit blocked by that payroll manager or that payroll hero that's been in role for a long time. But I think also it doesn't allow the new joiners and the entrants into payroll to become independent, and I think sometimes it's tricky for them to be confident when they're always relying on that hero. In all of the engagements we deal with, very rarely do we find any decent documentation behind the scenes. It's all in people's heads. Sometimes it's outdated, but in the scenario that I talked about where the payroll team didn't turn up on Monday, there was very little chance to rescue that business from that continuity perspective because there was no documentation. It was all in people's heads and they weren't there. So it was figuring it out. And again, documentation is one of those things that you write down and you never look at again because you don't need to, because you know it. But it's so vital to the rest of the business and for any continuity situation. So when you look at things like risk, resilience, and sleepless nights, I thought it was interesting to look at what people actually worry about. So any person in a senior management position, a leader position, they do worry about the unknown unknowns. Like everything seems okay, or I'm worried about the obvious things, but what's actually going to happen that I just have no visibility of? And I think the only way you can have visibility over the unknown unknowns is to have strong controls and good documentation. I know that involves a lot of reporting as well, a lot of data, but again, it's how that's conveyed to that leader so they at least get a sense of the facts and where the risks are, so they have less unknown unknowns. There will always be unknown unknowns, but let's aim for less of those. So integration points are a big fear, especially for payroll. Payroll, the architecture to facilitate a payroll, the technical architecture is generally very fragmented. And so there's several dozens, thousands of points of integration. Remember, payroll is processing data. That data can come from a variety of different places. And I think any one of those integration points are points of failure. If one breaks, that data can't come in. That will have ultimately a dire impact for payroll if payroll relies on any element of that data in order to run accurately. So I think, again, having visibility of that architecture is key. Is that then an IT problem? Or is that a HR problem because it's data? Or is it a finance problem then because payroll's a financial kind of process? I mean, again, you can see where it starts to get grey. Who owns the problem? But again, integration points are always big fears for people. And especially when you're using more cloud technology with kind of the smaller startup kind of organizations that can vanish overnight. Reputational risk, right? You screw up your payroll, chances are it's going to hit the press. So, and even if you marginally screw up your payroll, that's probably going to get the attention definitely of your competitors. So underpayments and non-compliance, this is people, and people have massive amounts of access now to being able to self-report publicly the failures of their organizations. And so the reputational risk, I would say, is a massive issue now for leaders to worry about. The key thing there is, again, having the controls in place to try and avoid that, have a defensible position to mitigate against that, is a lot easier to defend yourself when you have a scenario of an unknown unknown that's caused you a massive issue of which has gone public. And again, never forget that any payroll failures impact the HR massively in this area. Employee churn. If you can't pay somebody regularly on time, as per their your contractual obligations, that employee is going to leave. Very easy to leave employment these days and move elsewhere. It's a very, very fluid market for people now. It definitely will harm your recruitment because people won't want to join organisations where their pay is a little bit, kind of not accurate or not on time. And I think if you cannot, as an organisation, achieve the basics of paying people accurately on time, why would anyone want to work for you? So again, I think the impact on the organisation beyond just that individual or those individuals who were affected by some sort of payroll issue is kind of a drop in the ocean to really where this ultimately ends up. So I noticed the bullets didn't roll through here, so I'll probably fix that for the next time I do this. But are we too reactive on payroll risk? I think that's quite an important question here. So I think a lot of organisations we deal with, they do still treat risk as an after the fact audit, not part of their design principles. So what do I mean by that? So let's audit something and let's highlight the risks. That's fantastic. Now let's resolve the risks. So that's kind of a bit reactive. Now the proactive way would be to say, well, what are the risks that are aware to us, and how do we apply that to a design principle and avoid an audit that highlights risks? So it's about being a bit more proactive in that sense around risk. Sometimes risk registers exist. I'm a big fan of a risk register, to be honest with you, but I think what they often don't do is actually generate action behind them. So yes, I have a risk register of all of my risks, and I have them categorized as to how critical they would be to my organization if said risk occurred. But actually, when you think about it, what are we doing behind the scenes to mitigate that risk? But also, how are we actually testing the business resilience if that risk occurred? And I love a fire drill and scenario planning, and I think that's really important in payroll. Is if you think your software will be unavailable because of a cyber incident, or just because somebody turned it off, if that's possible, test for that, because that might happen. But again, a lot of time it isn't invested in those areas because it's seen as those kinds of, it might never happen. But when it does happen, you will be better prepared for it. And again, there's obvious risks that you can mitigate for, scenario plan for. I think a lot of organisations don't truly understand, especially in payroll, don't understand the high risk associated with things like segregation of duty or cyber or privacy within their own architecture, let alone the third party architecture. I often ask the question, at conferences, how many of your organisation forces two-factor authentication when you access HR and payroll data? And there's never a lot of hands go up. And I think that's one of the fundamental basics of securing, I would say, from those kinds of threats. So I think the proactive organisations, and how we would recommend people do this, is do conduct that in-depth risk due diligence, run those fire drills, deep dive the errors as more learning opportunities and preparation, not dealing with things on the fly. So as a final wrap up, what do you think is going to happen in 12 months? What do you think is going to surprise us? And again, I've got a few, I could probably go on for hours about this, but I'm not going to. I think what we will see that will surprise us, especially in payroll, is how quickly this AI and automation move from hype becomes very practical use cases in payroll, and especially around quality checks and query handling. Again, the hype around AI and payroll, it's the hot topic. It's being talked about all the time, and the marketing, the sales fog around AI solving everybody's payroll complexities is wonderful. But actually, I think we'll really see quickly from the noise, the hype, and the fog, and we will see adoption of really where it matters. And it won't be that glamorous, I'm afraid, but it will be around, I would say, the quality and the query handling. We will see to what extent regulators and employees expect more transparency around pay. So pay transparency, again, massive hot topic, but I think we're going to really see that in practice now, where again, it's not just around transparency of pay, but around accuracy. We already see that a lot around national minimum wage. We obviously see a lot around pay transparency as well. But let's see what those regulators do to really kind of force that through the businesses. I think we'll see a lot of payroll is legacy. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, seems to be the common perception, or it's too critical to the business to transform it. Let's just do everything else and we'll deal with that later. I think those days are starting to get a little bit numbered, if I'm honest. So I think those kind of, I've put safe legacy approaches here, I think they'll become quite visibly unsustainable. We're already seeing a massive push by some of the bigger software providers to move to that cloud or move to that new version, or definitely move away from those kind of legacy solutions. But I think we'll see a lot more focus on that, and we are seeing a lot of focus on it now, but especially over the next 12 months. You know, these companies do not want organizations running legacy, old premise payrolls anymore. I think that's got to be a real driver for that. Unfortunately, because there's always got to be some bad news, payroll budgets will remain low. And I think it probably will remain uninvested. And I think it will probably still be considered a back office function in 12 months. I kind of bang the drum regularly that I don't like that. I don't agree with that. I think that's a misconception. And I would just urge anybody in payroll to push that mandate of it not being that back office process. It needs that recognition. For all of these slides I've been banging on about for the last half an hour, the importance in this area is to raise that profile. Because until that happens, then the senior leadership probably will still just see it as a kind of low minimum cost back office process. And I think that's up to us as a community to kind of change that. And not that I'm down on the media, but they do love a horror story, and I'm afraid I think there'll be more of those around non-compliance more than ever. I mean, it's an easy win in media. So I think we'll see a lot of more in the press around those organisations being kind of whistle-blown around non-compliance, and good. I'm glad, because they need to be better at payroll, and it essentially does keep me in business as well, by the fact that we help them do that. So my advice to you as payroll leaders: you don't have to fix everything at once. Just pick 2 or 3 critical risks or improvements and focus on those relentlessly. And again, I've used the 80-20 rule before. A lot of people can spend a lot of time fixing the 20 and really just skim over the 80, because it's kind of individually in the 80, it doesn't make a massive impact, but together it makes more of an impact to the 20, hence the 80-20. But again, you don't have to fix everything at once. This is about planning, it's about structure, controls, and execution. And it is an evolving thing. So again, just pick those 2 or 3 critical risks or improvements and just focus on them relentlessly. I'm a massive payroll community believer, right? I love this community of payroll, and that includes the vendors and any suppliers. It includes the organizations and the professionals within it, and all of the agencies around that, the whole ecosystem. It's one of the most helpful places to get help. It is so supportive. Get help from peers. Talk, network. Just, your network is your net worth. Payroll is not unique to your organization. Payroll is in every organization. So one thing that ties every organization together, they all have to pay an employee or employees. So use that. There's a lot of Chatham House rules. There's a lot of confidential kind of forums you can be in where you get those help from peers. Your vendors. Your external specialist. Shameless plug, I know. But, you don't have to carry that whole responsibility and load internally. The best thing about my consultants is they've worked in numerous organizations, so they have a brilliant holistic view of what good payroll looks like. Now, you can't get that if you don't leave your payroll tin in your organization. So my advice is get out there, talk to people, understand, share, learn, engage. Carve out that time. It's your career. So invest in yourself and do that. Now, this is the one thing around. Most people hear payroll and just switch off, unless they're in payroll, and then they get all excited. But make the case within your business more business language. So talk about things like risk, cost, employee trust, not just payroll this, payroll that, payroll needs this, payroll needs that. You've almost got to try and convey the technical, the payroll, into business language so people understand it from a perspective where they appreciate things like risk, cost, and employee trust. So, and again, that's the art of consultancy, actually, is converting the kind of complex into the business. And again, that's very similar, the skills you need to do that in payroll. It's letting somebody understand what your concerns are without having to be an expert in payroll. It's a real skill, but it's very possible. And I'm very protective of the industry. So protect your team. Fight for that extra capacity, the training, the psychological safety. They're non-negotiable. I've always said it's people first, or it's life first, work second. That's how it should be. So if you're in a payroll leadership role, do protect that team, fight for that team. And also, if an organization is not listening, then question whether that's the right organization for you and your team. And above all, I want to thank you for half an hour of your life listening to me rabble on about payroll. But thank you.